Joy and suffering, two unlikely companions, but yet the Bible often puts them together when it's dealing with our Christian faith. Stay tuned. We are going to continue our study in 1 Peter, and today we will be talking about joy and suffering. Hello, I'm Brother Donnie Proctor, pastor of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and today we will be talking about two unlikely companions in what we normally think would not go together, and that is the idea of joy and suffering. The Bible often talks about these two together. Paul talks about the brotherhood of suffering and the fact that we suffer for Christ. James writes, count it all joy, brother, when various trials come upon you. That word trials could mean sufferings. And so we are to count it joy when this happens to us. So we'll continue our study in 1 Peter in the first chapter as he introduces this idea of joy and suffering. In verse 6 of 1 Peter, Peter writes, "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer griefs in all kinds of trials. They have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." So here Peter is encouraging us that even in our moments of suffering, that we should be able to find joy, because that suffering is the very tool that brings our faith into a completion, into a maturity. We rejoice in God's blessings, but at the same time, we suffer griefs of all kinds of trials. Now, this word grief in the King James Version is translated heaviness. We have a heaviness that comes upon us, but yet that heaviness is something that should bring or can bring us joys. We all go through various problems in life, or maybe we go through persecutions. We don't go through much persecution here in the United States compared to other parts of the country. We are not in any way in danger of losing our opportunities and our chances to worship God. This idea of trials in the New International Version, or temptations in the King James Version, is a Greek noun, and it can refer to either test or trials or the temptation to entice to sin. But we know that God does not tempt us to sin. The Bible does not say that, and it would be out of God's character to tempt us to do something that would cause him to not be able to look upon us. So we look at this as tests or trials. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was in school, test proved that I had learned the lesson. And oftentimes our tests are proving grounds of our faith. We talk about this idea of suffering and why bad things happen to good people. A lot of that can be simply seen as interpretation. I do not mean to belittle anybody's trials or their pains or their sufferings, but there's a story about a man who had an ingrown toenail, and he complained about the ingrown toenail until someone came up to him and said, "Well, at least you have a toenail. I've lost my foot." And this gentleman's complaining about his foot, and someone comes up to him who has lost his leg, and he says, "Well, you complain about your foot. I've lost my leg," and so on. It's the idea that there's always something that could be worse, but yet your pain, whatever it is still your pain. We try to figure out what is going on with that, and it can be somewhat described in God's will. Why would God allow this to happen, or why does God cause this to happen, even maybe? There are essentially two wills that we talk about when we talk about God's will. His perfect will, that will which is going to take place, and that will in which God has directed, and there's no rights or lefts to it. It is center line. It is God's perfect will. Jesus Christ will come back someday, at some point, in some way. We don't know what it is, but that's God's perfect will. That is going to happen. God's permissive will is that there are things that are allowed to happen that do not affect God's perfect will. I have often tried to explain this by using the idea of boundaries, or an alleyway. In West Texas, we have alleys between our houses, between the streets. There's an alley that goes down between the houses. Lots are oftentimes fenced. And so you could look at this alley as God's permissive will. Things happen between those two walls. You can walk down the middle of the alley, or you can bounce off of the walls, but you're not going to go outside that wall. You're not going to go outside that fence. That would be an example of God's permissive will. He allows things to happen. Now, in that allowing those things to happen, that is when our faith increases. And when we bump up against the walls, oftentimes is when we have experienced some kind of pain, some kind of trial, some kind of suffering. Now, if this did not happen, we would all just be on cruise control. And cruise control oftentimes allows you to go to sleep. I know when I'm on cruise control in my car, oftentimes I'm not quite as alert as I am when I'm having to be in traffic and off of cruise control and slowing down and speeding up and changing lanes when necessary. If I'm on cruise control on the highway, there's really nothing going on. And we would prefer, our human nature would prefer for us to just simply be on cruise control and nothing ever happening that caused any kinds of pain or grief. Another way to look at it is that many of us would prefer to be on the mountaintop all the time. And the mountaintop is great, man. The mountaintop is beautiful. You see views. We've recently been able to go to the Tetons in Yosemite, and we got up on the mountains, up on, well, we didn't get all the way up on the big mountains, but we got up on mountain tops, and you could see forever. The view was beautiful. When we were just in the Bay Area of California, Landell took me up to one of the tops of the hills there in Berkeley, and you could see over Berkeley, over into Oakland, over the San Francisco Bay, and you could see San Francisco, and it was beautiful up there. The problem is things usually don't grow on mountaintops. There's no growth up there. The air is thin. The soil is thin, so things don't grow. Things have a tendency of growing in the valleys. And when we are in our stages of suffering, when we have come down off the mountaintop for whatever reason, and we are in the valley and we are in our stages of suffering, our faith is growing, our faith is maturing, and that's essentially what the suffering and joy idea is. Now, Peter will also use this in a sense to define the smelting process of gold. In 1:7, he says, "These trials have come so that your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may be proved genuine and may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." The smelting process in which metals are purified back in ancient days was done through a crucible, and heat would be applied, and this metal would react. It would start boiling. The heavier metals, the gold, the silver, would all fall down to the bottom of the crucible, and the impurities, or what's called the dross, would rise up to the top, and it would be skimmed off and thrown away. Now, this process would happen several times. And after several times, then the metal would be what's called pure or purified. And so that's essentially just what's happening with the suffering part of our faith in our lives. I'm going to ask a question here, and it's going to be printed for you to think about, and give you a couple of minutes to think about. You may want to put pause on so that you can answer that question. Next week, we're going to be talking really more about the joy side of this equation of suffering and joy, and we will continue to see what Peter has to say about the joy. All right, until next week, be blessed.